to give some examples. One seems to have originated in the Harlem community of Rabbi Wentworth Matthew. Shout out to the so-called Black Hebrews, right? Another is a boy who was recently bar mitzvah. He is the son of an ex-Auschwitz Polish Jewess and a Seventh-day Adventist Negro doctor. Others, including a few Chinese, have been converted by me. So Rabbi Hooker of Kingston Synagogue is proud, right? You know, he's just like, yeah, we have diversity. Look at Corn's response. I want to be sure I am correct in assuming that no one, to your knowledge, has been a Jamaican Jewish Negro or mulatto for more than this generation, nor does anyone claim to be Jewish through parents or grandparentage. Look at what happened.
Yes.
You see the move that he's making?
Yes.
When he asks about historical Jewish presence in the present, he gets the response that he wasn't expecting. And so he makes this move to say, well, simply because we encounter Black Jews in our daily lives in the present doesn't necessarily mean that there is such a thing as a historical Black Jewish presence, right? Now this is going to play a dominant role in the scholarship. Now watch the response of the rabbi from Jamaica. It is correct to state that no one has been a Jamaican Jewish Negro for more than this generation, although a number of Negro non-Jews often tell me they're of Jewish extraction. It is a little more difficult to be agnostic about mulattoes. He wrote this, hand-wrote it, all capital letters, to emphasize his point. Since there are so many degrees of mixed race here, mixed blood here, but I would say that's probably true of them too. A researcher may be able to discover a few exceptions. Rabbi Corn responds back. Obviously, there is no evidence of any Jamaican Negro who has been a Jew. So I mean, I took a few minutes to get through the point, but you see the problem, right? That the problem is that the assumptions driving historical research into American Jews have excluded people from the beginning. And so when you start not appreciating mixture, and you start not being able to deal with segregated, racially segregated institutions, then you can't deal with problem number 3, which is ignorance of the familial consequences of segregation. It's not like these institutions just merely existed out of happenstance. People began to create family lives that would enable them to respond to these racist institutions in particular ways, right? So usually when people do research on Jews, they point to people like the Cardozo brothers, right? These are the sons of a very famous judge. And both of them, to my knowledge, were practicing Christians for at least part of their lives. And they'll say, look, if you had miscegenation during slavery, this is the paradigm. This is what happens. They assimilate, they become Christians, and they have no consciousness of Judaism. Usually without asking, mind you. They just assume. They have no connection to a Jewish past whatsoever. That doesn't explain people like, and I love this slide, Skin Watux. This is an artist representation of a woman who was known as Elizabeth Friedlander. And one of the things that people who do scholarship in religious studies know, but very few people talk about, is for hundreds of years, there was a theological belief that Native Americans, or whatever tribe, were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. There was this belief. But what people don't realize is that because that belief existed, you had people who were Jews immigrating to the New World, intermarrying with Native Americans, starting families, and then raising children as Jews under the pretext of that belief. So even though it's theologically not popular today, you have to bracket that theological prejudice if you want to do research on the history of Jews in the New World. So now you have people like these folks who are in my family. This gentleman is my great-grandfather. This is this is Grandpa Will Taylor. He was Creek. And his relationship to Judaism is in dispute in my family. He has a daughter. This is her right here, Jessie. Try not to say her name. This is my grandmother, okay? No one disputes the fact that she's a Jew. Matter of fact, that's the only thing I know about my grandmother. She died when my father was 2, okay? Everybody knows she's also Native American. This gentleman here is a cousin of mine. His name is Jerry. He owns a cabinet-making business a couple blocks away from the Jamaican synagogue where Rabbi Hooker was writing to Rabbi Corn from. And I went to Jamaica to have a conversation with my relatives about this issue because I wanted to know, like, what was the historical relationship between these Anusim, these Black Anusim, and the synagogues. And it was exactly my upbringing. He said, look, everybody knows we're Jew. He considers himself a Jew. She considers herself a Jew. There's no doubt about that. But even though he attended services, even though he participated in religious observances, he was not formally a member, right? And so he wasn't considered a part of the Jewish community. So the question for scholars is, how do these people do this? Like, how do you go through history and transmit identities transgenerationally without institutional mechanisms to support that identity? And I think they do three basic things. I think they learn the rules of assimilation, they learn their relationship to those rules, and then they perform social roles that allow a maximum of kind of self-outing with a minimum of social pain. And for the Durkheimians in the room, and a me. Now, the rules of assimilation are very simple. You conform to what the culture says, you get accepted, and the more you're accepted, the more you're allowed to conform, okay? However, there are times when those rules of assimilation do not apply, such as in my circumstance. What I did is I just made this little graph here to try to illustrate a little bit of what I'm trying to get across, right? So I just chose three cultural vectors that comprise what I consider my own conception of self, right? One is what I call Native Americana, one is Jewish Americana, one is African Americana. And you think that the person I think is me is where those three shades overlap. And generally, that's true. That's where I feel most comfortable in terms of cultural spaces. But this is the trick. What appears on the stage of history, what can be documented, what can be researched by the historian, oftentimes tends to be what's in this space right here and what the dominant culture says is permissible. So for me, for example, let's take Jewish burials. I would like to be buried in a Jewish cemetery. That sounds cool to me. My understanding of my cultural background puts my desire to be buried in a Jewish cemetery in this space, right? However, if I lived in a society which said that if you're a Negro, you cannot be buried in a Jewish cemetery, Jewish cemeteries are white-only spaces, then I, as a historian, am not going to go to the Jewish cemetery to look for a historical relic of my existence as a Jew. I would go to non-traditional places like this building, which has a lot of personal significance for me. Although I've never seen it, it doesn't exist anymore, it's in the middle of Florida. This is an old missionary Baptist church, behind which was the colored cemetery during the days of Jim Crow. This is where my Egyptian Sephardic Jewish grandfather